Anil, welcome. It's so good to see you. It's so good to talk to you. For those who don't know, Anil is like one of the absolute leading scientists who works on consciousness. He's co-authored with pretty much everybody at a certain point.
Not you
And
though, yeah, Eric. That's still to happen.
no, that's right, we haven't. But and I think what makes Anil so great, in my opinion, is that Neil is Anil Seth is a little bit of an agnostic. So, and I think that that's the best approach for a scientist coming into consciousness, right? So a lot of the work your lab does and that you've collaborated on is both on one side theoretical, so taking sort of theoretical stabs at consciousness, and then on other times, what Anil does is stuff that's like very, very, very empirical. And I think that that's incredibly healthy. Like you're one of the few people in the field who sort of doesn't who has theories, but I would never describe them as pet theories. And anyway, so it's always a joy to talk to you because um I think you're like more fundamentally of a scientist. And in that like really fundamental way that scientists are supposed to sort of keep some options open, put pressure on certain ideas, but then also say, well, what about this other area? And I think that that's something that doesn't happen sort of enough in consciousness research. And anyways, if you want to learn more about Anil, you can just type his name into Google. He's got a book that came out maybe 2-3 years ago called Being You that was really excellent. Both a great summary of the field, but also sort of like an advancement in many ways too. But Anil, yeah, absolute pleasure to talk to you again.
Um, Thank you, Eric. And let me just say that I'm really happy to be having this chat with you as well. It's great because I think you're also very rare in. I think we share a lot of interests that's very hard to find collected in single people. So an interest in consciousness, an interest in emergence, an interest in formal measures, and I think an interest in writing as well. I think those are things that we both think are all important collectively. So I'm very grateful for you to hosting this. I'm looking forward to our chat and to chatting with everyone else who's here as well.
Yeah, so I was saying to everybody that basically I'd like to just keep everyone muted and just you and I talk for like a little while, and then people can sort of begin to casually chime in once you feel that we've talked enough, and we'll have plenty of time. So we'll get to all of that. But I wanted to sort of start with one thing that's always like super helpful is just to start with like quick definitions of consciousness, because there's always this sort of question of definitions. And I think as scientists, it's both important to have something you can point to and say, okay, this is the phenomenon that we're discussing, but it's also a little bit dangerous to assume too much about the ultimate nature of consciousness before you start doing your empirical investigation or your theory building or so on. So what's your sort of like pre-paradigmatic, naive, definition of consciousness that you tell if someone on an airplane asks you, like, what do you study? What do you
Yeah,
tell
that's
them about consciousness?
that's really good actually because it just reminds me I was doing something on the radio in the UK the other day and it was like this general news program and we have like 3 minutes to try and talk about consciousness on the news and that the presenter who's a very smart woman. I mean, she said consciousness is that does like that means sort of being aware of your role in society or something like that, and it just sort of brought it home to me that there are very many intuitions that people have. I mean, it's a very polysemious word, and so it is necessary to definitions are needed in part to make sure we're not talking about different things. But Eric, you also, I think, rightly pointed out that you don't that they're pre-paradigmatic, right? Definitions are going to continue to evolve. So that the one I still kind of cleave to, I guess the most informal definition I like. Actually, I first heard, I think, really put this way from Giulio Tononi, who Eric used to work with. He said consciousness is what goes away under general anesthesia or when you fall into a dreamless sleep, and it's what returns when you wake up or come round. I think that's really good. And if you couple that on the one hand with on the other hand, the definition made famous by the philosopher Thomas Nagel that for a conscious system or a conscious organism, I think he says, there is something it is like to be that organism. And the intuition there is that, it feels like something to be me, it feels like something to be you, but for a table or a chair, it doesn't feel like anything. There's no experiencing going on. It sounds a bit tautologous and circular, but I don't think that's a problem in the sense that it's just emphasizing that there's a there when it comes to experience. Some things do and some things don't. And then you can sort of drill down and finesse and nuance that definition in all sorts of ways: access consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, self, level, all sorts of things. But fundamentally, it's just that experiencing is happening, that it feels like something to be a conscious human being, and that when you're under deep general anesthesia, if it's deep enough, it doesn't feel like anything to be the organism that you are.
And I think I like that because there's this very common consciousness research is something that has dealt historically with a huge amount of skepticism, that this is even a thing that scientists should really be looking at. I think it's very hard to do neuroscience without talking at some point about consciousness. So you're sort of forced into it by necessity. But there's this very common like definitional move, and it's one of the few philosophical moves that I really can't stand. When people make like, I'm sort of willing to argue like many things, but there's this definitional skepticism where it's like, well, if you can't even define it,
Yeah.
what are you even talking about, right?
Yeah, I think that really annoys me as well. And it's sort of, to me, it indicates people are just looking for a reason to dismiss having to even think about it. Because as you know, I mean, there are so many examples in the history of science, history of philosophy, where definitions go from the kind of pre-paradigmatic, let's make sure we're all talking roughly about the same phenomenon, to something that is much more specific, much more precise in terms of specifying mechanisms or sufficient necessary conditions and so on. So yeah, I think the the fact that there can be different definitions is important. But yeah, to say that you can't study it because there's no precise definition is just misunderstanding how science works.
Yeah, and I understand where some of that skepticism comes from. I mean, this is something you've talked about in some of your papers and your books, which is that we do often talk about consciousness as if it is this like lone singular entity, right? That you're having consciousness, and that like every conscious experience is sort of fundamentally the same. And the closer you get to, you mentioned the philosopher Thomas Nagel and his what it is like to be definition of consciousness. What is it like to be a bat? That's the consciousness
Mhm.
of the bat, and so on. Um, I think sort of the closer, one thing that is true is that in consciousness research, the closer you get to hewing very close to that definition, you start thinking about it as one sort of fundamentally singular property. Like if we can just find this one property, then maybe we can explain the whole thing. What's sort of your take on that, on that like spectrum of like thinking about consciousness as sort of this like myriad number of forces, like there's selves and there's memories and there's
Yeah.
attention, and then on the other hand thinking about it as like there's this one property which is just being qualitative, and like which one is dominant? Is it helpful to think about that? Is one like going too far?
I think that's a really interesting thing to dwell on for a minute. On the one hand, if we're trying to uh, we can diffuse a little bit the idea that there's one thing, one big scary mystery that is consciousness, by recognizing that in humans it's expressed in many different ways. There is self, there are memories, there is agency, there is body, there is emotion, all of these things that together characterize what consciousness is like for a typical human being. Of course, we all differ. Um, and that I think helps because it means that we can think about what might help us understand consciousness need not help us understand all of those aspects. That those might be contingent aspects for human style consciousness, which is still important, but it's a slightly different thing. And even now, I think there are some interesting uh, ways in which assumptions about what consciousness has to be like can be challenged. And I think this is really helpful that lots of people over history have assumed that consciousness is to do with rationality, to do with maybe mind, to do with language. This is sort of a more Cartesian perspective. And now I think we don't necessarily think that way, that we can divorce consciousness in general from the human exceptionalist, sort of anthropocentric um, uh, biases that might otherwise constrain us. Like even now, I think with the rise of language models, it raises the very interesting for me question about whether a system could truly understand without being conscious. Because for us, those things tend to go together. It's like, understanding requires, it's like, yeah, I got it. But maybe, those are actually divorceable properties that a system could have. It's just we've never been faced with something that has made us recognize their dissociability before. So I think all that is useful, and it reveals that maybe there is. So what is left? Is there something that is still consciousness once you've accounted for its contingent aspects? Is that the shared common factor that we are talking about when we're talking about consciousness? And I honestly, this is, I guess, where partly my agnosticism comes in. There'll be some philosophical perspectives which say no. Once you've accounted for, especially the functional dispositions, you've accounted for everything. But I still tend to think that yes, there is something that is common um, to all the contingent aspects of the ways in which we experience things, and that is that is what we're going after. Now, whether that common shared property of being conscious, of it feeling like something to be something, whether that need map onto a single underlying explanation, that's another issue. I think it may be that there are many different, maybe there are multiple realizability, many different ways in which that basic property um, can arise. And here the analogy that I think is useful is life. I talk about this in the book, really. I know it's an imperfect analogy, but there is no single thing. Well, arguably, I mean, you could still argue about this, but it's not obvious that there is a single thing that demarcates the living from the non-living. Yeah, we all know what we're kind of talking about when we get beyond those gray areas. There are things that are alive and things that aren't. But our understanding of life was not progressed by trying to find the single, spark of life, elan vital. It was by recognizing the ways in which living systems manifest and explaining those properties. So I guess this is what I call the real problem of consciousness, this divide and conquer approach, while remaining a little bit agnostic about whether after you do all that, whether there will be something left over or not.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think ultimately you're probably right in that there's this huge host of things that we want explained when we say we want a theory of consciousness, and it makes sense to think that there might not just be like one sort of singular answer. But to be totally honest, I think I'm a little bit more of like a theory radical, in that I basically view the rest of the neuroscience of consciousness as effectively just like cover, like a carapace to like protect, just the very idea that there are some people thinking about how do you actually create some sort of theory of consciousness. And I don't know if anyone's ever really, I don't think anyone's ever cracked it yet. I mean, I think that we have some prospective theories that are quite good, but I'm a little bit more of a radical in that I think that there probably is this like one big answer, and that some paper is going to blow all of our minds. I mean, I sort of like dream about this paper, right? It's like, it could be 6 to 8 pages. Like that's what's so funny about this whole thing. It's thousands of years of human history, our own personal confusion for decades, right? And like some, 6-page, little scientific note. You could be like, oh, why didn't I think of that? Of course, this fully explains how physical systems can have, subjective properties or so on.
Yeah, I mean that would be lovely, wouldn't it? I mean that would be the paper we'd all like to read, and even more like to write. But I just want, I can't rule it out. This is part of the issue. We can't rule anything out. Well, we can rule some things out. I can't rule that out. That would be kind of nice. But I wonder whether that's under us. And I know you've got a sort of radical skepticism of the utility of most of the neuroscience of consciousness, which I think is pretty useful. But I also, progress can also be made in how the questions change too. And I think this is often underappreciated. Like we think we can be pretty clear about like what the problem at hand is. We have neurons, we have other stuff, you know, carbon, whatever level of description you want to say, and then we have consciousness, and how does one generate or give rise to the other? Or maybe it's the other way around if you're an idealist or something, or maybe they're two aspects of the same thing. But it could be that the kinds of questions we ask will change as well as what we might take to be a satisfying answer. And the second point is, the first point is illustrated already in how thinking about consciousness has changed. Like, we think about what would be a satisfying explanation of free will. It may no longer be to have like something that acts as an uncaused cause. It may be something a little bit more subtle that still picks up on what we want to preserve when we want to preserve a useful notion of free will. But then the thing with consciousness more generally, and I wonder what you think about this, Erik, but I think we have this slightly higher bar for what would count as an explanation because we are conscious. And that's a kind of epistemologically unique situation. Like we want it to be intuitively satisfying and sort of like, oh yeah, that's why I have this experience now. And of course we want it to be intuitively satisfying in the sense that it works and that it explains things. But when that thing is in some unique sense us, then my suspicion is we might ask more of a science of consciousness than we're really legitimately entitled to. And this is not to be an illusionist and say, there's nothing there, and but it is just to notice that that we may apply different criteria implicitly in the science of consciousness. Whether that's justified or not, we can discuss, but I think it happens.
Yeah, like I think you're right that we do fundamentally treat it to a higher bar because we ourselves have it. But I also think that that can be justified in a certain way. And like one analogy that I dwell on is, for a long time, particularly in the 80s, people were developing this new science of complexity. So they're asking this question of like, what is complexity? And they came up with all these really good, very interesting mathematical definitions. But there is no like one exact measure of complexity that everyone ended up agreeing upon. You sort of have like these different approaches. You can look at the entropy, you can look at like the logical depth, you can look at the integration and the differentiation. You can do all these things to capture this notion. And there's a lot of overlap. But at the same time, I'm totally comfortable saying, well, complexity is this sort of naive property that we think of as being out there in the world. It's not really one thing. It's like this family resemblance. And it's really just this abstract notion. And it's fine if that abstract notion doesn't really map completely perfectly onto the scientific picture of the world. Versus with consciousness, I feel like if someone made that same intellectual move, it feels like you're in a different position to sort of refute it, where your personal evidence that there is this thing called consciousness that you lose when you enter a deep dreamless sleep or so on is just so much more direct. It's like one of the few things in science where you're actually looking for something that's like real rather than sort of like useful enough. Right. And we're sort of put in that position of looking for something real rather than just useful enough because we have some sort of weird direct access that's difficult to, to fully comprehend when it comes to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's all true. I think the more general point is what do we do if we have a science of consciousness that's perhaps very good at explaining when we have particular kinds of experiences and so on, but it begins to diverge from our folk psychological attributions. Now, when those are applied to ourselves, that's the sort of, I guess the ultimate thing would be like you're under general anesthesia, yet, the consensus theory of consciousness says that you are having conscious experience. What do you do? What do you prioritize? Probably then you say, okay, look, that's something where the data should override the theory. The theory is not correct because it conflicts too much with the sort of the baseline starting points from which we were supposed to construct a theory construct to explain why you're not conscious under general anesthesia. But there could still be some wiggle room. It could be so like, okay, look, maybe you've lost aspects of consciousness, but there's still something really low level that can explain why it doesn't feel you don't remember it or something like that. Um, but I think I think that's kind of far as I think it's fair to use very, very definite things like loss of consciousness and anesthesia versus not as beacons to tell whether we're on the right track. But then there are other things where I think we can be mistaken, about the first person evidence. We're not very good at reporting our own experience, and we often take, the content of the experience to be literal in a way that doesn't, I think that is not helpful. Again, another example here might be something like an out-of-body experience. For some people, a satisfying explanation of out-of-body experience would only be something that explains, that how indeed your consciousness can in fact leave your brain. But of course, that's not, for most neuroscientists, going to be the kind of explanation that is proposed. It's going to be something that explains why it seems as though you're seeing things from a different point of view. And some people might reject that as well. Then you're not really explaining an out-of-body experience. You're explaining something else.
Right.
And so I think if you iterate that strategy, you can sort of see that we can be overconfident in the nature of the first person data that we have. And certainly there's the case of when we are making claims about things that aren't us, then I think we are in a tricky situation. Like, you know, if our theories suggest that a newborn infant is not conscious, until the age of 3 months, that's a tricky situation. Like, what do we use to arbitrate those kinds of decisions? And we're going to be running into this with AI, of course, which is going to give us a very powerful impression, perhaps incorrigible impression of being conscious when there is, at best, a huge lack of consensus and I think, if anything, a consensus in the opposite direction about the state of, the actual matter of fact of the situation.
Yeah, it's funny. I was just thinking, right as you said that, how much the world has changed since the last time I think we spoke in person or so on, which I think was in Greece, at a conference there. If I remember correctly, there was a hurricane.
Oh God, yeah, the
And
Medicaid. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
yes, that's right. That's right. And that was only in like 2019 or 2018 or
yeah.
something like that. And, you know, the, the science of consciousness, I think at that point looked like looked for all the world like a very small academic discipline that really still at that point didn't have any, massive necessity, right? But since then, as you said, AI has exploded. We now have basically one of the few other things on the planet, maybe the only other thing on the planet that can at least make linguistic claims to consciousness, whether or not you believe them or not. But certainly that's a bar that I didn't see coming at all. Um, and then just related to that, because this is something I wanted to ask you about in general. Now people are using AI in the sciences, and another thing that has changed, about our own field since then, is that people have actually not terrible sort of mind reading abilities now with neuroimaging. I mean, you using the same sort of transformer architectures, using the same sort of things that these large language models do, where you feed in the data from neuroimaging into some transformer, and it outputs like an image, like almost like Dolly does, but it's what you're seeing. And this always struck me as so interesting because it's like this decoupling of prediction and control from explanation. And it's sort of, it's sort of like, I worry that if we start looking at things like that, and we think, okay, well, this is sort of all we need, but we don't really have a lawful reason, or we can't dig out a lawful reason for why it is, that the AI is correctly picking up that you're seeing a field, or a cityscape or whatever. What sort of, just to get more specific before we talk about AI too much, what's sort of your opinion about these recent techniques? Like, do they tell us something about consciousness? Are they sort of like false pathways? Are they like only beneficial? Like, what are your thoughts on these?
Can I just ask you to clarify one thing in that really useful summary where you said they decouple prediction and control from explanation? What did you have in mind?
So when I think about explanation, and so I think about, let's say the physical laws that control the complexity of like a leaf blowing in the wind. It's a very complex thing. You could probably create all sorts of statistical correlation techniques that tell you about where the leaf is going to blow. But in theory, if you had perfect knowledge and you could apply, the physical laws that we know of gravity and how air turbulence acts, you could chart it like perfectly.
Mhm.
And if someone said, I have a very good, ability to like track this leaf, and all I have is this AI that watches and does leaf tracking. Sorry for this not so great analogy, but I have this AI that just watches
Okay.
it. And I don't know if, the AI is actually understanding any of the physical laws, or whether or not it's just sort of like approximating parts of them. And I wonder if that will happen in neuroscience too, or we'll have some scenario like that where we actually get pretty good at mind reading, which you might think requires the theory of consciousness, but you just end up with something that's sort of like this approximate statistical filling in stuff.
Yeah.
And then really a theory of consciousness would like take the full brain state, run it through some sort of laws about how consciousness occurs or so on, and you would get out like the precise answer of exactly what you would get in much the same way as a physical law would.
Yeah, no, so yeah, so let me just put that in my own words and see if I've understood you, because I think it's a very nice distinction. So, it may well be possible, it seems to be becoming increasingly possible to predict what conscious experience somebody is having through churning their imaging data through some algorithms that may be loosely based on the brain in some sense, and also potentially control what experience they have as well. But we would not know why A, they're having any experience, and B, necessarily why they are having even that experience. We're just very good at being able to detect, to predict and control. Yeah, I mean, the triad of the things that I think are important for the real problem of consciousness are prediction, control, but also critically, and perhaps most importantly, explanation. There has to be an explanatory link between the mechanisms and the phenomena. So I think that could happen. But I think there's reason to be cautiously optimistic that um, the reason these techniques can be useful is they're picking up on something. It may not be it's not going to be the whole story, but they're picking up on something. Now, the bulk of why they work might be because of the machine learning side of it. This has been something that's been said for a long time. Like the ability of these things says more about what happens when you have a ton of data and a ton of compute rather than anything about the brain. But it's not, that's a little unfair. It's telling you something. And there's historical ancestry going on there. Of course, these are abstractions in some sense of distributed systems doing stuff. So I think I can imagine, for instance, they put constraints on possible theories that you might induce, and they may even propose you may even be able to like derive theories by looking at what these systems actually do, at some level. You know how they work in some basic principles, but how they work specifically might still be something that you go and investigate that model that might give you a sense of what's going on. Of course, there are also disanalogies, like the transformer architecture in particular is often called attention in machine learning, but it doesn't seem anything like attention as it operates in the brain. But I think I just see a spectrum of things. Like, at one level, you can have a very generic machine learning classification system, and it can be very good if you've got enough data and if there are enough regularities in it. It's like in some of my work, we use autoregressive modeling this way. It's just like a very liberal model. You throw data at it and you get some picture of the statistical dependencies. But then as you can go away from that, and like in the imaging thing, you go more towards things like dynamic causal modeling, which actually have a generative model of how the data are generated, and you kind of test those. So I think you can get the way I see it, you can get closer and closer. Like one example from my own lab is we had a fun thing from a few years ago, which if anyone's ever seen my TED talk, for instance, is in there. It's this kind of like loads of hallucination-like version of Sussex campus with loads of dogs everywhere. It looks a bit psychedelic. So we had that using a simple feed-forward network run backwards using what the Google Deep Dream algorithm that's now nearly 10 years old. But what we've done since then is finesse that algorithm to model very specific different kinds of visual hallucination, the hallucinations that happen in Parkinson's, compared to those that happen in psychedelics, compared to those that happen in Charles Bonnet syndrome after visual loss, because they all have different phenomenologies, these hallucinations. And so, now our models count as mechanistic hypotheses at some level of description. Not about why experience is happening, but about why these different experiences have the experiential character that they do. So that's the way I think I'd see this evolving. But we always have to be careful, like how much explanatory burden is on the brain side and how much is in the sort of generic properties of the machine learning.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I worry that it won't, it'll go too far in one direction. Although I do think that if I were going to Henry Markram the field today,
Please
I think
don't.
I think the pitch would be, instead of building like a perfect brain model, you build a massive AI that just inputs brain states and outputs what it thinks the experience is.
Mhm.
And then you let the AI sort of solve it and get like really, 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 really good. And then you just like see if you can take the AI apart and see how it's doing it. And then you sort of dig out your theory from it, from like its own brain.
We should
I
just say
don't
there
know
was
if that would work, but I think it's a better big neuroscience collaborative project than just, modeling the brain.
Yeah, by the way, there was a I just saw in the chat. What is it to what is it to Henry Markham a field? You should probably explain what you mean by that, Eric. For those who don't know.
This is the person who originally proposed and tried to get going the $1 billion initiative. I believe it was in Europe. It was called the Human Brain Project, I believe. At the final title, originally Blue Brain Project, or grew out of that. And the idea was to take, massive, what one problem, and this is a problem that, Anil probably deals with all the time, far more than I do, which is that neuroscience is pretty like mom and pop right now in terms of its style of science, right? Like people do things in their lab. They might have some sort of techniques or background, implicit training in how they do things that make it difficult to replicate in other places. Sample sizes generally like aren't too large or so on. I don't think it means that like all the science is bad or anything, but it definitely means that it's sort of scattered out. Or another way to say it is there's no Large Hadron Collider equivalent for neuroscience, right? It's all just spaced out. And Markram wanted to basically build the Large Hadron Collider of neuroscience, and the idea was to create like this massive biophysical model of the brain. And I think that approach, creating a model, is interesting, but I think like the equivalent approach now would be to create an AI that is very, very good at scaling up these techniques to predict experiences from brain states. And I think you could say, you need $1 billion to do it, and maybe if you're friends with enough people in Europe, in the European bureaucracy, you might be able to get it.
Just to dwell on that for a second, I think there's a massive and noticed at the time disanalogy between what the Human Brain Project was doing, what the Large Hadron Collider was doing, because that needed to be big to solve a very specific problem. But with the Human Brain Project, the idea was just let's just build as detailed a model as possible, which seems actually to fundamentally misconstrue what modeling is good for. Modeling is only good when you throw away some detail, and you get some abstraction from it. If the map is the territory, then there's no point having a map anymore. So it was always a strange idea. I just, as an amusing side note, I just put something in the chat. I ended up writing a comment about the Human Brain Project for The Guardian 10 years ago now. And amusingly, and it's quite critical of it, but amusingly, the press people for the Human Brain Project seem to just be scouring for any media coverage and put it on their homepage for 2 weeks before they realized that it was really saying, this is not going very well, your project, is it?
Yeah, I
If
both.
anyone's seen the film In Silico by Noah Hutton, you should see that because it's a fantastic fly on the wall documentary of what happened. But to your point, Eric, I think it would be unfortunate if the controversy and perhaps failure of the Human Brain Project put people off from taking a big science approach to the brain, because some aspect of that might be necessary. It is a little bit, as you said, mom and pop, very small labs. My group is like less than 8 people or something, and some amount of collective endeavor seems as if it will be necessary.
Um, time is flying by. So I wanted to say that, if you start, before we sort of go to general questions, but if you start hearing something and you realize you have something to say that's like specific to what we're talking about, please do raise your hand. And while I wait for that, I wanted to move on to, just while we're talking about controversies in neuroscience, I wanted to move on to something that I wanted to chat with you about for a while, which is that last year there was, and this actually says, I think, a lot about the state of the field. So I think it's like it's very relevant. Last year there was this letter signed by 100 scientists that made a very big deal about calling one of the, I think I'm comfortable calling it one of the leading theories, but certainly one of the more prominent theories about consciousness, which is integrated information theory. It's a theory that I've worked on personally for a little bit, and the letter used the term pseudoscience to call it, and I forget if who said it was like a nuclear bomb. It might have been David Chalmers, who
Yeah, it
used
was.
that analogy. And I sort of felt a little bit, shocked and taken aback by it. First, like, your in terms of your initial conception, but then also, like, has it had much of an impact? What was, it's going to be a year at some point, in a couple months, what was this anything? I mean, this was big news. It was covered in the Atlantic. I think you and I both ended up talking to someone from there, and I think we both ended up with unfortunate quotes from us. Which is a
I
good
certainly
lesson
did.
for scientists without media training.
Yeah.
When you're
I
talking to a
have media
very
training and I still messed up. So,
a very convivial reporter.
yeah.
But yeah, so we're like, what are your general thoughts, both on like the initial stuff, but then also like this longer playing out process? What have been the
Yeah.
effects of this nuclear bomb that was dropped on the
Well,
field?
not good, to summarize it in 2 words. You know, Eric, by the way, I want to give you, I think I said so at the time, but I thought you did a very, very helpful and useful deconstruction of the original letter in this almost line by line way, which was
Thank
which
you.
was needed and was not something that I thought I could do for sort of various reasons of, for one reason, I co-direct this Canadian research program on brain, mind, and consciousness, and like, this was a big problem within our program because we had a bunch of people on it who'd signed this letter and a bunch of people who felt really pissed off by the letter. So, I was trying to not be too partisan while making very clear that being honest to my initial reaction, which was frankly one of um, disappointment. It wasn't surprise because I knew something like this had been in the offing. Um, I think I was surprised by how insubstantial the arguments were in this letter when it came out, and by the use of the word pseudoscience, which I thought was spectacularly unhelpful because it's such a strong claim, and the impression it gives for people not in the field is that the field is therefore a mess. Um, so I think there are two ways to look at this. One is the effect within the field, and one is the effect on people outside or adjacent to it, which in a way is even more important because that's what will define how the field progresses over the next 10, 20 years. One of the things that's been a great joy since I've been working in this area now for like a distressingly large number of years. But one of the things that's happened, it's gone from a very small coterie of people. Like when I went to work for Gerald Edelman because it was one of the few people who was doing it because he had his Nobel Prize. But now it's pretty expanded, and people consciousness adjacent are also, feeling free to write, think, talk about it. Anesthesiologists, statisticians, I don't know, psychiatrists, all sorts. The view, if the view is if the dominant view from the outside is that the field is not scientific, is not mature, then that puts people puts people off who are adjacent, and I think that's a big problem. Um, so yeah, I was really disappointed. I think pseudoscience is, what does it mean? It means something that's purporting to be scientific but isn't. And there are examples of that in things like homeopathy and other things, flat earthiness, and which is very clear pseudoscience. But IIT, and I have to say, for those of you who don't know, I'm not a proponent. I've also worked on related ideas, um, but I never worked as part of the group, and I find it problematic in many ways. But I don't think it's non-scientific. I think it's extremely creative and challenging theory that I'm glad it exists. I think it's wrong, but as I put in this Nautilus piece, which I just probably know, I think it's wrong, but I think it has the right to be wrong. Um, and I think that's constructive. It does make testable predictions. But anyway, without going into the details, I found it unhelpful. I wondered why. I was surprised by the number of people that signed this. I thought that's surprising to me. Why is that? Is that because people just want this theory to go away? Is that because they don't understand it? Is that because it's too mathematical? Is that because it's philosophically uncomfortable? Or is it because they think it really just is not helpful because it's not fully testable? And I can't speak for what was in other people's minds, but the impression it gave was um, that that we don't have our house in order within the field of consciousness science. Now, that was a long time. That was September. There has been this rolling, under the surf after the flurry of media coverage. There's been this rolling sort of set of discussions and discontent, and people on the more moderate side of the letter, people on the more extreme side. I believe a version of the letter will come out in a journal at some point. I do not know what that will say because I'm not obviously not part of the people writing it. You know, that could make things better because it could provide a more nuanced point of reference. But of course, it could equally make things worse by stirring the pot again. But I do suspect, and just based on what I hear from people that I talk to, from funders, from journalists, from you know, that it made a big impression on people, this letter, and generally really not a positive one.
Yeah, and it was funny because when I went to go study IIT with Giulio Tononi, who's the founder of this theory, it emerged in the early 2000s. One of the things he said to me was like, you have to be very careful working with me because it's not a surefire path to a viable career.
Yes.
You will get a lot of discontent. And I think you attribute, the very best motivations to people. You listed a number of reasons, like maybe they, actually believe it, but also, scientists are humans and there's a lot of professional jealousies and rivalries in fields, especially fields where have that little bit of a pre-paradigmatic field. And I think, I'll say it, which is that I think a lot of this stuff is sort of like personal stuff that has been building up for years and years and years. And, if I had been going into the science of consciousness now and I had seen that letter,
Mhm.
I probably would have taken Giulio like a lot more seriously, with that sort of warning, because the one label that is so devastating to a scientist is to be not a scientist, is to be a pseudoscientist. You'd rather, you'd be wrong. Everyone will just, you'll be shamed and sad, right? Like we can pretend that scientists are sort of objective about their own, ideas and opinions and so on. But on the surface, everyone will say, well, this is the self-correction of science. It's fine for people to be wrong and so on. And that's good. And if you can make yourself believe that, that's even better. But I do feel that, a huge amount of this stuff is driven by, fundamental forces like that. But we don't have to
No, I
go,
mean,
go
well,
deep into that.
just to say that the letter did say clearly that, it was also worried about the amount of media coverage the theory gets, the amount of funding that it gets. And I don't have I think those are not really that well justified criticisms, but they may be. I don't have the data on how much funding IIT has gotten relative to other theories and so on. But those are separate points. That does not make something pseudoscience. That is not. And that is the, without that word, things would have been much less contentious. And just to close the loop under this, I was having a conversation the other day with some of my colleagues and friends at Sussex, and we were thinking again, like, come on, we have collectively a lot of problems with IIT as the Tononi group articulate it, but they're substantive problems. They're philosophical, but they're also technical. It's like, okay, so we're kind of really think now maybe the time's right now to write this up in a substantive way and try to steer the conversation more back onto discussing the theory on its own terms and criticizing it. I think that's totally fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, everybody. So if you have questions, now is a good time to begin to jump into them. I just saw someone posted on a chat. Is there a parallel with string theory where it feels like a lot of the criticism is based on its publicity? I mean, my opinion would be, yes. And in similarly, I think that you can critique string theory as being unfalsifiable, and some people have, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not scientific, because it's sort of like saying, well, let's say I propose a very complex idea. Let's say that idea is very fecund. It attracts a lot of research. There's all sorts of new debates. People even develop new mathematical formalisms based off of the idea, maybe even new empirical tests. And then eventually someone shows, well, wait a minute, there's this issue around falsifiability of this thing. Should I just go back to the beginning and I'm just now like a pseudoscientist, from the beginning? It's almost like you can't allow people to propose something complex out of fear that you'll eventually be labeled with something. I mean, that's sort of my more extreme take on it, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. But I'm no expert in string theory.
So I also, one thing, oh, we have a hand up. Brian. Go for it.
Sorry, I'm trying to get my camera working. So I'm often arguing with determinists, and I'd love to get both of your take on free will. That's one of the reasons I've been so attracted to Erik's work. And Anil, I'm less familiar with yours, but one of the things I argue is I find there's a lot of arrogance in the determinist position that, hey, we can apply everything we know about non-conscious systems to consciousness in saying how causal effects work. And so I kind of say, hey, this science of consciousness is so nascent, it's so undeveloped. So I'm kind of arguing in the other direction when I'm talking with determinists, because I'm trying to say, how can you be so arrogant and sure in your conclusions about determinism given how young this science is?
Good. So yeah, this will keep us busy for the rest of the session then, now that free will has been mentioned. So Erik, you'll have to do some firm sharing about this. I mean, shall I start, and then Erik, you can tell me where I'm going wrong. I do find it absolutely fascinating. It goes back to where we started this conversation about what we would take to be a satisfying answer. And my basic position is that the whole debate over whether the universe is deterministic or stochastic is a massive red herring. It doesn't matter. And it can only really matter if the kind of free will that is trying to be preserved is a kind of what I, in my book, denigrate as a spooky free will, a kind of libertarian free will that we shouldn't even really want. This kind of free will in which the conscious experience of willing something goes in and, mixes up the atoms, or whatever it does, makes things go in a different way than they otherwise would. I was listening a little bit through clenched teeth to the debate between Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky on his podcast, and it's really annoying because Sapolsky's pretty clear about this, that for free will to exist for him, he wants the macroscopic property, that the consciousness or whatever it is, to endow the microscopic with some new property, some new things they do. And I think, well, that's just misconstruing what we should be looking for. Now, so just to expand, so what goes in its place? What would be a satisfying version of free will that is, in the philosophical parlance, compatibilist? That is compatible with a deterministic position, but doesn't really care, could equally be a stochastic universe. So I think it's true that for creatures like us, some of the actions we make have causes that are relatively internal. So if you trace the causal chain back, they stay within the confines of the brain and the body more than other actions. If you're just kicked in the leg, let's say something like that. So there is an empirical difference between voluntary actions and involuntary actions. And I think the experience of, and Mike Shadlin has a nice word for this, he calls it a freedom from immediacy. So I think the experience of free will is what happens when the brain is perceiving the cause of an action it's making as being relatively internally driven. So that's our perceptual experience of that. That feels like, and that has a number of characters. It feels like it's aligned with what we want to do. It feels like we could have done otherwise, and it feels like it comes from within. And all of those characteristics make sense if you think that's what is being perceived. But just as we shouldn't confuse the content of a perceptual experience with the way things actually are, we shouldn't do the same with free will. So, if we have an experience of red, we know now, we're quite comfortable with the idea that red is not literally out there in the world, but there is something real out there in the world, and red is a useful thing for the brain to experience, to pick this up in terms of surface reflectancies. For free will, it may feel like, the content of an experience of free will may be that I'm causing this action. Doesn't mean literally that I am causing this action, but it's still picking something up that's useful, which is that because that action was driven largely from within, then the next time a similar situation might come around, the organism could do something differently the next time by changing. So I think this feeling of could have done otherwise doesn't literally mean you could have done otherwise, which is why it's compatible with determinism. But it's still useful for the organism because the organism, in virtue of having that experience, might change in ways that it does something different the next time. So I think of free will as a kind of perceptual inference, but it's also like a self-fulfilling perception because every action is a kind of perception. It's a perception about, a prediction about, an inference about proprioception fundamentally. So there's this sort of interesting nexus of ways of thinking, I think, that makes sense of it's instead of saying, does free will exist? You say, what are the characteristics of the experience of free will and how do we explain how those come about? In a way that's then useful for the organism. The final part of the puzzle, and this is something I'd really like to hear Erik's view on as well, is this idea of downward causation. Maybe that's part of the phenomenology of free will, that it feels as if the macroscopic is causing the microscopic somehow. And I think there are also very sensible ways to think about downward causation that are compatible with determinism, where macroscopic descriptions carry more information about microscopic or enslave them. And we're beginning to have the information theory mathematical tools to describe these kinds of things. But actually, they go way back to sort of Scott Kelso and ways in which global properties enslave local properties and things like that. So I think we have all the tools we need to make sense of free will that make it completely irrelevant whether the universe is deterministic or stochastic, and hopefully can denude us of this persistent temptation to try and rescue a kind of causally efficacious, spooky, soul-powered, causally potent nonsense.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. I absolutely love that. I mean, I totally agree, and I feel some of the same, frustrations wherein I think what oftentimes, if you want to use the term determinists, although as you say, whether or not they're determinists might not matter very much. I think generally it's more useful to think about the field as a set of basically philosophical attacks or argumentative attacks on free will, and there's like 3 or 4 main ones. And then the question is, can you sort of like diffuse these using what we know about the scientific worldview? And if you can, if the arguments sort of begin to become questionable or fall apart, and you mentioned downward causation as being one of them, then at some point you have to have like more and more desperate arguments, or more and more, extremely philosophical arguments. Like some of the most famous philosophical arguments around free will is this notion of fatalism, and it's almost like this logical proof of fatalism. Well, the person who wrote that did not believe it. It was supposed to be like a reductio of how ridiculous this view is, and they end up later basically abandoning it. So if you hinge your arguments against free will just on pure, like, very abstract philosophical logical stuff, then you yourself are open to attack from other philosophers about, like, maybe you're not doing it correctly, or so on. But I want to point out that Anil, when it comes to this question of downward causation, which I think is like one of the tripod legs to have some sort of fundamental notion of free will, you just need to have it be the case that things that exist at a macro scale, some people might call it a higher level, can have some sort of real causal power or efficacy, because whatever you think about your own consciousness or so on, it's clearly not occurring, or at least probably isn't occurring, at like the fundamental Planck space, Planck time transitions, right? It's like we're talking about neurons, or we're talking about groups of neurons, or we're talking about things more abstract than that, like representations, memories, conscious experiences, what have you. But clearly those are somewhere higher up. So for those to matter at all, you need to have some sort of downward causation. And Anil actually wrote one of the first papers of sort of this genre, which is I think it was on Granger causality, and I think it was back in like 2008 or so. And it's this great paper saying, hey, yeah, there's this big philosophical debate, strong versus weak emergence or whatever, but like, let's try to put some mathematical formalisms on that. And I think ever since then, the field has sort of progressed apace. And for me, the way I think you get around this issue of how could you have the macro scale, these like new macro scale properties that pop into existence or whatever, is that, well, you can have something that the macro scale possesses that the micro scale doesn't, which is error correction. And this, I've sort of laid this out if anyone's interested in sort of these papers on causal emergence, what I call causal emergence. But it's really just applying the mathematics of error correction, which are these, error correction is like how your phone works, right? It's just like this really fundamental information theory stuff about how to get around noise. And it's always struck me that scientists generally don't work with deterministic models. They work with stochastic things. They work with, there's always the chance that, something happens in the sun, and there's a bit flip in your model somewhere or something, right? Like you're exposing yourself to uncertainty all the time as a scientist. Most of the systems that we study are fundamentally uncertain. We don't really think of them as real, fully deterministic systems. And once there's some noise available at the micro scale, you can build a macro scale model that essentially corrects for that noise, and the noise vanishes. And what that means is that because the models that you're building are about the causal dependencies between the variables, that means that the causal dependencies are stronger at the macro scale. But there's no new property. The new property is just the error correction. And, to date, I'll just be like honest. I mean, I still think that that's, just to like declare my own biases, it's like this is my own research and so on. I think that probably fundamentally causal emergence is correct. I really still have not, there's been very popular arguments against it, but if you actually work through them, they end up not being good arguments, like even if you take them very, very seriously. And so what I think is probably going to happen is that eventually someone will come along and sort of repackage the idea in slightly different mathematical formalisms and much more philosophically anodyne, and everyone will accept it. But I do think that if something like that is true, then you have very good answers about issues like downward causation, and even the most philosophically advanced arguments against free will that rely on the lack of downward causation, things like Jaegwon Kim's exclusion arguments. Causal causal emergence, if it's true, like just assume it's true, basically makes mincemeat of it. Like it's just so easy to explain where the extra causal power is coming from and so on. And so I'm still sort of like this like diehard believer in that.
Good. I think because well, no, I mean it because that's like that, and just to be honest as well, this is still for me where I have the highest level of uncertainty in the extent to which we need real versus apparent downward causation. I can totally happy where you can get apparent, whether we really need real and what that might even mean. Whether that distinction is a real distinction is something that I think does depend on the formalisms that we use. And all of these can be done in a way that's totally consistent with what in philosophy you call supervenience, right? Which is where the micro fixes the macro. There can't be a change in the macro without something happening in the micro. So that's one thing I think that also has to be respected in these discussions. And I think all of our conceptions respect that.
Yeah, and it surprises me that, and again, just because I actually don't, it's funny. I mean, I'm sure you have this yourself as a scientist, right? You sort of like have papers that you're like, this is a fine paper, but I don't know if it's true, right? Like I it's good, it's true by like the methods at which I arrived at, right? But if you were to bet, you say like, okay, take your life savings, bet on like that being an accepted thing in science in 100 years. I think actually a lot of times you'd be like, maybe I'm not going to do that. Even if it's, stuff you put your name on and you think you have a good methodology and so on. And causal emergence, remains to me something that I'd be willing to like bet on. Like I would put my life savings on the line that in 100 years, it might be a different name, but there'll be something like that as the commonly accepted one. Again, this sounds like grandiose, but it's basically my only belief about anything I've done, or even contributed to, that I would be willing to make that sort of bet on. And I think a big part of that is that, in the research, we just take these, like, instead of saying like, oh, emergence is going to be this really complex thing, so let's look at like complex systems. It's like, no, let's look at like the simplest, most stupid system that you can imagine. It's just like a couple little bits of interacting elements. And then let's really be directly compare the micro scale to the macro scale. And, to this day, I've never seen like what I would term like a very fair comparison get away with what like the causal emergence formalisms get away with. Because not that you can't have a conception of emergence that's different than that, but if you do this like very hardcore, is it creating more macro scale power? And I just don't see a way to do that other than error correction. Like I just don't, other than some sort of new properties popping into existence.
I think we're in danger of rabbit holing on this one, but
yeah, sure.
But just to put a pin in that, because we should discuss this another time. But there's all this stuff with partial information decompositions that I'm part of working with, which is perhaps another way of thinking how that might be done. And again, it looks at really, really simple systems, which I think is a very good insight. You don't have to have huge amounts of complexity to talk about emergence. Anyways,
does anyone have any question? I mean, we've seen a couple questions about consciousness as well. Maybe while we wait for just to jump to a more maybe general thing that people feel they can contribute a bit more to, because Anil and I could talk about this all day in ever increasing finer details. When
from Alexis, I see a hand.
Yeah, I had a question a little ways back, but sort of drawing a division between the kind of, I don't know if it's what's called the hard problem, but why is there a first person perspective? Why does it feel like to be a thing? Part of the questions of consciousness, and a more mechanistic, hey, maybe it's a bunch of contingent functional mechanisms, and as we understand that, we'll understand things better. Focusing just on the easy side of the functional mechanisms, like I'd be curious what you both think we understand now that we didn't understand 10 years ago. Like, is there progress on the smaller bore, break it down into functional mechanisms by thinking about neuroscience or psychology or by using imaging? Yeah, I'm totally unfamiliar with what's moved in that area, and I'm curious what you guys would highlight as the big movements in that area.
To me, it often depends like how I'm feeling when I wake up. You know, if I wake up some days, it's like, Jesus, we've made no progress at all. The field's a disaster. And then other days, it's like, no, come on, think about it. You know, just because I think the problem working in it is you've got this kind of change blindness. Like I don't perceive the change because I'm sort of looking at this thing all the time. And um, but if you step back, I do think there's been actually quite a lot of progress, an often underestimated degree of progress in the as you say, understanding the structure of consciousness from different directions. And we've outlined a few things already, things like out-of-body experiences, various kinds of hallucinations, I think are now quite well understood about how they may arise. I think so the debate's moved on a lot from just looking for neural correlates to trying to look for explanations, at some degree with some degree of explanatory purchase. So, in my area, this whole framework of predictive coding, I think, has been very useful in moving away from just, this area lights up when you're conscious of something versus this to like there's a network of processes that are explanatory connected to what we are perceiving and that we can test. We can test the impact of expectations and top-down signal flow in all sorts of ways. And then I think there's also been a lot of progress in actually measures of complexity applied to global states of consciousness, conscious level. Marcello Massimini's work looking at what he called the perturbation complexity index is, I think, really outstanding here. We begin to have consciousness meters of a very broad sense. You zap the brain with a bit of energy and you measure how much the echo bounces around the brain in a quantifiable way. And it's not a theory of consciousness, and it's not an approximation to phi even, but it's a very important advance in giving us a handle on what partially explains, but certainly helps us predict changes in global conscious states. So I do think there's been quite substantial progress.
Yeah, I think that certainly there's been, and also like just to add to that, like very briefly, I also think that everyone has a better vocabulary now than when I started the field, like better vocabulary about talking about consciousness at all. So the scientists have more adept philosophical understandings. The philosophers have a more adept scientific understanding. And I think that like even from when I was first reading stuff in the field, like the mid 90s, papers in the mid 90s when I was in undergraduate, I still feel that by this point there's just so much more of people being on the same page, even if that page involves like very serious disagreements, like fundamental disagreements, but at least the language. And that may sound like a small thing, but I think it's quite a big thing, and I think it's very good. Anyways, is it Eli? You had your hand up for a little while.
Yeah, hi. But I think Biver, I think you were first, right, man? I don't want to go behind before you. Or sure?
Whoever. I haven't been great at keeping track of it.
Yeah.
I'm happy to go, but be like, okay. All right, sure. I saw, Anil, that on socials you talk about like one of the things that you're thinking about is biology required for consciousness. So basically, what's your kind of like vision for testing that hypothesis? Whether AI can have consciousness, let's say.
Yeah, now you've asked me the toughest question. I don't have an answer. I mean, I honestly don't. So it's like I wish. So this actually is interestingly related to the whole pseudoscience thing, because people criticize IIT for not being testable, and then I'm talking about this like consciousness is a biological phenomenon. It's not, or at least I think we should be skeptical of the idea that it's fundamentally about computation or information processing. But then how do you test that? What experiment could you in principle do? And I just don't know. I would love that, and this does worry me, and I do think I think there are experiments that can be done that show increasingly. So just to set the context here for those who might not know, I mean, there's like most theories of consciousness assume either that consciousness is a form of computation, in which case AI systems could have it, either it will just happen, or if you implement a computational theory, in AI. It will have it. Doesn't matter that it's made out of silicon or whatever. It's just the computation that matters. Other theories like IIT are not computational, but they're also what I would say substrate flexible, that you could implement something in a different substrate and it would be conscious. But there's also this I'm kind of always been skeptical, well, not always, but actually for a very long time been skeptical of the easy assumption that consciousness is computational, what's called computational functionalism. An alternative perspective is that consciousness is a biological property. It really matters what we're made of, in the same way that rain, actually real rain, needs to be made of water. And a simulation of a hurricane will never actually be windy. And I don't think this is a stupid idea. I mean, it comes originally from John Searle. It's like, it's hard to say why that should be the case, but it's also hard to just rule it out as meaningless, because there are things for which it is the case that the substrate really does matter. And I think a fair position is to be agnostic about it, unless there's good reason to believe one way or the other. And so part of what I'm really doing now is trying to make the best conceptual case I can for why computational functionalism is in trouble, why we should not assume that that consciousness is a matter of computation, and make a strong case on the other side for why we might think that it's our nature as living systems that is important. And there's tons of pieces of this to trying to build this case. But there's one important distinction, which is it might be that only biological systems are capable of implementing the right kind of functions. Like there's a sort of contingent biological naturalism here that it just is the case that to get the kinds of functional organization that are relevant for consciousness, you can't do it in many things. You can only do it, with certain kinds of material. I think that's a plausible position. People are, and other people are moving to that as well, to at least take it seriously. Even Jeff Hinton, amazingly, he has this really lovely idea of mortal computation now, which is that even if the brain does computation, it has to be just for energy constraints. It's got to be doing it in a way that is unlikely to be separable from the substrate. You need too much, in Erik's terms, you'll need too much error correction otherwise. So I think there's lots of good reason to think that whatever it is that's responsible for us being conscious is not easily separable from what we are made of. But that could be for a number of different reasons. The strongest case that consciousness depends on our nature as living creatures sort of dives right down into thinking about a continuity between, in my case, prediction as a core mechanism for consciousness, and also prediction as a fundamental principle of even metabolism, of metabolic regulation, homeostasis, this concept of autopoiesis. Like our cells don't just do things, they regenerate their own conditions for existence. We're very different kinds of machines in that sense. We don't just turn information into information out. We don't even turn product into product out like a factory. We regenerate our own materiality. And if there's a through line from what best explains our conscious experiences down to what we're made of and how that comes to be, then I think you've got a very strong case for taking seriously the fact that consciousness might be intrinsically tied to things that have this property of self-generation, self-production. It's not to be carbon chauvinist. You could have perhaps other things made of other things that also work like this. But computers as we have them don't work like this at all. They're a world away from this kind of thing. So that's the case I'm trying to make. How do you test that? Well, I think you have to build it incrementally. There's already some sort of lovely experiments looking at, for instance, how spiking in neurons, if you want to understand why a neuron spikes when it does, you can only understand that through some sorts of intracellular protective mechanisms. It needs to spike occasionally in order to not die, basically. And so already have something where even if you want to understand the functional higher order description of what the system is doing, you can't do that without understanding that these things have other constraints based on their substrate. No. So there's a kind of weak view where epistemically we will never understand consciousness without seeing it through the lens of our nature as living creatures made of the kind of material we're made of. But there is also a stronger case lurking there. It's not just we won't understand it, but that it just has to be that way.
Yeah, I really wanted to see an application of the sort of mortal computation view to consciousness, because I think it's such an evocative forget even the ideas, it's just an evocative phrasing to begin with. Ellie, yes, or Eli, sorry.
So Erik, this question is for you, and I want to bring it back to the nature and future of consciousness. We haven't talked much about the future, but one of my favorite ideas from you is intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic versus
it's not just from me, but
your idea of extrinsic drift. Like I'm really taken by that idea, and I've been wondering if you've heard the ideas of Jaron Lanier, the VR pioneer, where he imagines post-symbolic communication, right? His vision of VR is not that it will be just surface like the holodeck, but that it will be a medium for us to express ourselves, you know? Like the way that we emote, like I'm emoting right now, or the way that we use reaction GIFs. Yeah, I just wonder if you've ever thought about it in written in your essays. I think I found it. Yeah, like a more hopeful vision of what VR can be, not just a very extrinsic place, but a way that we can like rally reality to communicate. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That's definitely interesting. Just so people know the terminology. So extrinsic drift is what sometimes people talk about this divide between, extrinsic explanations and intrinsic ones. And I think you can also think about it as having like an extrinsic perspective on systems and having an intrinsic perspective. Some of this terminology is taken from Giulio Tononi, who has this wonderful idea that you can sort of base the mathematics of consciousness by trying to take like the intrinsic perspective of the system. But I also think it's this sort of broader concept, and actually something I talk about in my more recent book is that all throughout world history, the extrinsic and the extrinsic have sort of waxed and waned. So sort of which perspective is dominant has shifted, across time, and both perspectives have actually also gone through a historical development. Like just like if you go back and you read the ancient Greeks, their metaphysics and science is primitive compared to ours. But also if you go back and you look at like how Homer discusses minds, the ability to discuss minds and to discuss internal subjective states is also much more like primitive and ham-fisted compared to like James Joyce, right? So you see these concurrent developments, and extrinsic drift is my term for what happens when you begin to lose like intrinsic mediums, So I think that it's arguable that science itself affects culture, but also that mediums can explore the intrinsic versus extrinsic perspective differently. It's interesting to think about VR in this, because VR it seems as if it should be sort of like a fundamentally intrinsic medium, because you're changing, your conscious experience. But I think one thing that's so wonderful about language and about books, and particularly I think novels, is that because of the way that the author is portraying the world, which is just represented in language, in a novel, people's perceptions, thoughts, emotions have just as much reality as their physical surroundings. So you could say like Harry Potter felt mad. Well, that's me like pointing to Harry Potter being mad. Like I can actually talk about his anger because he experienced a deep red hot anger, or something like that. And you would know what I was talking about. Versus in the Harry Potter movie, if you want to show that Harry Potter is mad, you have to have like Harry Potter kick a chair or, turn someone into a frog or whatever to sort of try to express that. And I think that, as if you privilege artistic mediums that are extrinsic to extrinsic, you really can't get much of the intrinsic perspective in there, and you actually end up ham-fisted. It's not really an argument for literature being better than movies, because movies do the extrinsic perspective so much better than novels do, but novels do the intrinsic perspective. And I think VR is an interesting mixed case. I haven't read Lanier's stuff too much, but I'm sort of skeptical at things that change human nature too fundamentally. I think it will remain kind of what it is, even as the world accelerates and changes around us. But yeah, it's an interesting thought. VR is definitely one that I would group under more intrinsic. But I think that there are actually some serious limitations to the medium because of how it's structured. Anyways, we have Anthony.
Hi there. Great discussion. I was just wondering, you mentioned, of course, that you have some issues with IIT and presumably other theories. I'm wondering, what are your intuitions as to like which aspects, whether it be certain axioms or other ideas in these theories, are likely to survive? And, what are your favorite aspects of the various leading theories?
Well, I mean, my theory is going to survive, and all the other ones will ultimately go away. No, I mean,
we're the
don't
same,
know.
Anil.
I don't think any. I think all theories are wrong, and will fade. Some might be more wrong than others. I think there's an interesting tension that I've seen emerging a bit lately, which is, do we look for ways to distinguish between theories? So there's this whole program of so-called adversarial collaborations now, which try to pit different theories against each other. I don't know, probably people have heard about some of these. IIT's been quite involved in many of them. They've been illuminating partially, or I think mainly, because they reveal how poorly the theories do when they're required to make these kinds of predictions. It's very, very hard to design an experiment that really weighs heavily or disambiguates strongly between theories. This is one of the things that we've seen in those collaborations so far. So there could be look for what maximally distinguishes the theories and then see which kind of win out empirically. But there's an alternative strategy, which is to so what's in common? What do they all have in common? And maybe that's something that we should really focus on. And I think both are probably useful things to do. For my money, there's some aspects of, let's say, IIT, I think are likely to be part of any final story about this. And that for me goes back to before IIT. One of the reasons I got into consciousness science was reading a paper in 1998. I read it in 2000 when I was finishing my PhD, by Tononi and Gerald Edelman, who was later my boss, Consciousness and Complexity. And it was the first paper that I'd read, and I didn't know anything about the field. It was the first paper I'd read where it tried to show and build an explanatory bridge. Like, every conscious experience is complex in the sense that it's lots of things going on, or it's different from every other experience, but it's also unified. And it's like, oh yeah, that's true. And so what's happening in the brain should also have these properties. And it's like, good point. So let's try and at least articulate what that would look like in the brain. It's like, that's a good idea. And so since the late 90s, I think that basic idea that consciousness is informative and integrated, and something under the hood has got to be like that as well. That's, for me, I'd be surprised if that wasn't somehow an idea that survives. Another idea that I think is likely to survive is this idea of prediction. I think there's something fundamental. Maybe it won't turn out to be about consciousness per se, but it will certainly be part of the story about how we understand the different manifestations of consciousness. And I know I'm biased there because that's, while I do work in the IIT complexity thing as well a little bit, I spend more time thinking about the brain as a prediction machine. Maybe that will turn out to be just like a level of description we can just get rid of once we really understand what's going on under the hood there. That would also be fine, but I think it's at least a necessary step on the way to wherever we're going to get to.
Well, I love that, Anil, especially because, but it also makes me sad because I had a whole host of questions for you about predictive processing and sort of your stance on it and how far your agnosticism extended into it. But I do see that I have kept you now for about over an hour and a half. So you know, I'll give some time for like final thoughts or final questions, and then we can wrap up. And then if anyone needs to start traveling for the eclipse, start poking holes and things, start putting your sunglasses on, they can start getting ready to do that. So any last questions for Anil or I?
Well, people are thinking that. I'm just remembering the eclipse that I saw in the UK. The thing that really took me by surprise was not just that it got dark, but it got really cold and windy all of a sudden as well. Because I guess the temperature over, I was by the beach in Brighton, the temperature over the sea changed more quick. You know, you get this temperature gradient that's following or a transient in temperature which follows the eclipse too. I wasn't expecting that, and that made it seem much more like, whoa, what's really happening than the darkness.
I love that. I'll look out for that. Okay, well, if we don't have anything more, I'll just say like a huge thank you to Anil for spending so much time with us today and chatting. And it's always just like, it's always such a pleasure. I'm glad we managed to catch up as well. And thank you for everybody on a day like today of stopping by for a little morning discussion of consciousness before you go experience something really cool, or at least see people on social media posting about it. Anyway, so thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Eric. Thank you, Anna. If she's already, no, she thinks she's gone. Yeah, it's yeah. Thanks for allowing us to have this chat and for taking part in it as well. And I'm very, very jealous. I wish there was going to be an eclipse here, but it's just a cloudy afternoon, as it so often is in the UK. But there we go.
Thank you.
Oh, everybody should read Eric's books. Eric's books are also fantastic, so I highly recommend them. You know, the Revelations it's a very unique novel, and I haven't finished your other book yet, but I am reading it. But
lovely. Well, thank you so much, Anil. I really appreciate that. Okay, everybody, thank you so much. I'm going to end the session now. Oh, I just saw the Revelations there. Okay, very cool. Bye now.
Bye, everybody.